Let's begin this study first by reading the scripture. In Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created." Now there's a lot to unpack in that verse, but I want to focus on the fact that it says that God created all things. 4 words, pretty simple. And any child can accept it and believe it because it's such a simple concept that God made everything. I want to begin tonight by quoting from Vernon Kellogg. He's an evolutionist. This is from the Atlantic, which was an article not written too long ago. And I'm just going to give you his words. "The evolutionist believes that the description of the origin of the earth and life in humankind as given in Genesis is a mythology, perhaps allegorical, at any rate not true as a literal account of these happenings." So to understand what he just said in that statement, just to clarify it, he's saying that the evolutionist does not believe that Genesis is a real story. It's a myth. It's perhaps at best allegorical. It's just something that was made up by the writer of Genesis to sort of encapsulate and gather together the information so that it will be understandable in a story as to what happened. Then he goes on to say, this, however, because they believe that Genesis is just a myth, this, however, is something quite distinct from denying God or refusing to see in the Bible a guide to the highest of human conduct and an inspiration to the highest human ideals. So you can't really believe Genesis, he says, Vernon Kellogg. You can't really believe Genesis, but that doesn't mean you can't get something noteworthy out of the Bible to try to help you along in life. Well, the fact of the matter is, if Genesis isn't real, and Jesus Christ testified in Matthew that it was real, and he wrote in the books of Moses, he mentions that. He also mentions Adam as being a real person. If you can't believe that Genesis is real based on the testimony of Jesus Christ, then you can't believe anything else in the Bible. A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. One mythology, one made-up story, something that isn't really happening. Abraham wasn't real, Adam wasn't real, the creation wasn't really real, then you just have to reject the whole thing, and that's just pure logic. So the modern-day evolutionist may have been forced by his own thinking into being at least acknowledging God. I won't deny that some of them do deny God. Many of them don't. But what they believe is a really religious doctrine, just like your belief in the Bible is a religious doctrine. And you believe the Bible from cover to cover. You believe Genesis to Revelation. You believe the Word of God to be true because God says it's true and because also it proves itself to be true. It's just that the evolutionist says, well, you can believe in God, you just can't believe in a God who wrote the Bible. And you can't believe in a God who said he created it the way that he created it. That God, the evolutionist who is a theist, believes that God maybe did it in the way that they dream up. But if God didn't create as he says he does, and of course we believe that, but just bear with me, if God didn't create the things the way they are, if God can't be attributed to that, and it all came by just spontaneous generation, then how do you explain the uniqueness, color, voice, instincts, habits, whatever you want to call them, of each kind of animal? For example, I've written on the board the rabbit, and the rabbit has a very unique track. And of course, all animals do. If you're a hunter and you find the tracks of an animal and you're experienced and you know what you're doing, you can tell the difference between the track of a bear and the track of a deer. At least I hope you can, or you're in real trouble. What gives the rattler the rattlesnake to the rattlesnake? I'm glad they've got them. That thing rattles to warn you that you're in danger. And if you've ever come across a rattlesnake, you'll never forget it. But why doesn't the copperhead have that? Why doesn't other dangerous animals have that to warn you? But the rattlesnake does. The turkey has a gobbler. The whiplash has ugly beads on its neck and has a beautiful painted breast. So trying to explain all those things outside of God nearly becomes impossible, that no two kinds of creatures, no two kinds of taste or smell are the same for those animals. They are just different. Now I know some people say that rattlesnake tastes like Kentucky Fried Chicken, but I've never tasted rattlesnake. But I'm sure it just has a unique taste. Trying to describe it to people, they just say, well, it is like this, but it certainly isn't that. If you taste chicken versus rattlesnake, I'm sure you can tell the difference. But with that said, let's revisit a little bit about last week's lesson and build upon those laws. Now, according to evolutionary theory, now I've written 4 laws or precepts of evolutionary theory on the board, but according to evolutionary theory, matter came into existence all by itself without any outside force. So I've given you before the ways in which this world it's here, and you have to explain how it got here. And one way you can explain it got here is by God. God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1:1. But if you accept that as being a myth, and as an evolutionist does, he just said it. If you believe that's just some made-up story, some allegory, that Genesis 1:1 can't literally be taken true, then you have to come to the conclusion that things got here by itself, just spontaneously. The other option is it's not really here. And that's just somebody who's in cuckoo land that doesn't know it's here. So we just dismiss that outrightly. So it just comes down to, it just got here naturally, or it got here supernaturally. Those are the 2 choices you have. As Bible believers, we accept it came here supernaturally. As the educated scientist would say, it just came here naturally. But then you have to ask the question, where did laws come from? Where did laws spring up from? And people assume that they just sprang up spontaneously, and of course they assume wrong. So the grounds with which they build this false assumption are these. Number 1, laws sprang into existence. They just appeared magically, just somehow appeared. Now, common sense of any intellectual who has any sense knows that can't be true. I'll prove it to you in just a minute. Number 2, matter originated from nothing. So there was nothing, and then all of a sudden there was something. And we can agree with that from the standpoint if you put that God made it from nothing. But when they say nothing, they mean nothing. They don't mean God. They don't mean any supernatural power. There was just nothing in existence, and then all of a sudden it begins to formate. It's never happened before in history. It's never going to happen in the future outside of God. Bring God into it, all things are possible. But just for it to happen, if I stand here with nothing, I'm never going to make nothing, and nothing's ever going to come out of it. But that's their second point. Matter originated from nothing. Number 3, living things came from non-living things. Illogical, impossible, unless you bring God into the picture. But even God didn't do that according to Genesis 1, which Vernon Kellogg says is a myth and an allegory. But you know Genesis chapter 1. It says that God made the fowls of the air. He made the beasts of the earth, the living creatures. He made the fish of the sea. He made great whales. God made all that. But evolution teaches and exclaims and demands that living things came from non-living things. That is illogical, just as number 2 is, and just as number 1 is. And then number 4, I don't think we're going to get any better, but in number 4 it says matter and living things. So matter which came from nothing and living things which came from non-living things. So matter originated from nothing, and that nothing became non-living, and then living things were born from non-living things. And then to sum it up, matter and living creatures keep becoming more and more complex. So you begin with something simple like a one-cell amoeba, and it eventually evolves over millions and millions and billions of years. It eventually evolves into who you are today. And as I'm talking to you and using technology to be able to talk to you, that actually all came from nothing. You came from nothing. You were not made from the dust of the earth. As Genesis 2 says, Vernon Kellogg says that's an allegory. It's a mythology. It's a made-up story. God says He formed you out of the dust of the earth. He made you a living body. He breathed into your nostrils the breath of life, and you became a living soul. Now tell me which is easier to believe. I mean, to believe this, guys, means that you have to have a great deal of faith. Maybe more faith than we have to have that there is a God. And maybe they brag about that, and it puffs them up with pride, call us ignorant and lazy because we believe in God. But the Bible says in Psalm 14:1 and other places, a fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So what the evolutionist has done, according to Mr. Kellogg, is you have come to the point where you believe, well, yeah, there's a God out there, but He's not really involved in anything, or He just did it this way. And He said it out there, and there's God, but laws sprang into existence from nothing, matter originated from nothing, living things come from non-living things, and matter and living creatures become more complex. Now, if I told you that, and you thought you just turned to a comedy channel, you'd be laughing your head off. And it is really ridiculous. It could be comedic material if people didn't take it so seriously, but they do. They take it seriously. But that's how everything came to be. But then you have laws called the laws of thermodynamics, and there's 2 we're going to look at in this study to refute these things and show you that these 4 laws, evolutionary theory, we're not going to call them laws, they're theory. These 4 things that they say cannot possibly be true because of proven, identifiable laws which are in practice today. These things are not happening today. They happened, according to the evolutionary theory, they happened millions and billions of years ago. But it's not taking place today. You don't see men sprouting wings and flying. But if that theory is true, then you're going to continually become more and more and more complex. So the laws of thermodynamics, which are demonstratable, is number 1, energy itself cannot be created or destroyed. It can be changed, but it can't be destroyed. You cannot destroy energy. Einstein came up with an equation, very famous, one of the breakthroughs in science. Is he proved, by demonstrating it, that energy equals mass times the speed of light, doubled, squared. So if you take the speed of light and you multiply it, square it, multiply it by itself, and then you add mass to that, then you come up with energy. And energy, once it was made, once God spake, let there be light, let the waters bring forth, and that happens, that's energy. God is energy. God is light. And in Him is no darkness at all. So all energy comes from God. All life comes from God. All existence comes from God. The breath that you're breathing right now comes from the hand of God, according to the book of Daniel. So once you have that energy, man can't create it anymore. What you do with energy, drive your car, walk across the floor, eat your meals, that energy that you have, you can't make more and you can't destroy what's there. So I don't know if you know it, probably you do, but this equation brought about the ability in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, by the way, in East Tennessee, to be able to make the atomic bomb. Create's the wrong word. They just invented it. So they take this theory, this law, this practice, which at first was a theory by Einstein and proved to be a demonstrable law, unlike these four things, which have never been demonstrated. It's all theory, it's all guess, it's all hypothesis. But this one is the first law of thermodynamics, and from this came the atomic bomb. So they take an atomic bomb in 1945 and they drop it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki over Japan, and they blow that place to smithereens, but they did not destroy energy. They destroyed buildings and they destroyed people, they destroyed land, but they didn't destroy energy. It just manifests itself in another way. So you can't create it, you can't destroy it. Number two, the second law of thermodynamics is that the law of increasing disorder, that's called entropy, the law of entropy. And the law of entropy says everything runs down. Nothing runs up. It runs down. Your batteries run down. You have to change batteries or recharge them. Cars run down. You fill it up with gas and you give it energy, but eventually it's going to run out of energy and run down. In the Bible, we call that the principle of human collapse. And that's demonstrated best in the book of Judges, where the children of Israel have a judge, and as long as they have a judge, they're following God. But once that judge dies, say Gideon or Samson or Jephthah, there's lots of judges, 16 I think in the book of Judges. Once that judge dies, then the children of Israel go downhill. Entropy, chaos, energy running out. And when they go down and begin serving other gods, the judge dies, they begin serving other gods, and they go into captivity, they're under oppression. They finally realize, hey, we don't have to live this way. They cry out to God, and God sends them another judge, and as long as that judge is alive, that positive energy, that positive leadership, they serve God. When the judge dies, it's downhill again until they repent, and then they're back up. And that's the principle of human collapse, which says this: unless God regularly intervenes in your life, you will fall apart. Entropy. So here it's demonstrated on this little chart. God made the heaven and the earth. He created all things, our verse says. Of Jesus Christ, it says, without Him was not anything made that was made. He created all things, and by Him, Colossians says, all things consist. He holds everything together. Little kid's song says, He's got the whole world in His hands. And when God created it, He created it with perfect order. That was the intention, and that was intended to live and go forever. Man was to eat, God's original plan, man was to eat of the tree of life, and he was to live forever. But we know what happened. Man sinned. And when sin was introduced into the universe, first by Lucifer, but then by man, when man took the fruit and ate of it, then death was introduced. And from that point on, for the last 6,000 years, Adam was made in 4004 BC according to Archbishop Usher's timing, everything is run down from there, from death to destruction. And God is then going to, at one point, destroy the world. He did once in Genesis chapter 7, 6 and 7 and 8, when he destroyed the world by 40 years of flood, destroyed all of mankind and reshaped the universe. That's a great study, describing and coming up with what happened after the flood. For example, Mount Everest and the Grand Canyon. Evolutionists will tell you that the Grand Canyon came from the Colorado River. Okay, the flood makes a lot more logical sense. You see, God doesn't ask you to believe in things that are illogical. He may ask you to believe some things that are hard to believe, but he never asks you to believe something that just doesn't make sense. If you bring God into the equation, everything makes sense. Walking on water, raising the dead, healing the leper, healing the sick, everything makes sense if God's in the equation. It doesn't make sense if God's not in the equation. Then you're just left with theory. So here's what happens with the second law of thermodynamics. Everything runs down. You run down if you don't eat. You run out of energy. So you eat food and you get more energy, and therefore you're able to function. You must rest. If you don't rest, then you're going to run out of energy. God's giving you those gifts as a way to keep your energy up, but just don't eat for about 20 days or 30 days or 60 days. See what happens. You've seen pictures of it. It's demonstrable. You've seen the pictures from the Holocaust where people were starved to death. And you look at them, it's horrible to look at. It's downhill. The law of entropy. Now here's what evolution says. On the contrary, this evolutionary theory. You started out with nothing. There was nothing here, and then all of a sudden you have plasm, and then you have chemicals, and then you have organisms, and finally you have man. Man came from nothing. And he eventually became more and more and more complex. That's the evolutionary theory, and it's a theory and it's not demonstratable. Oh, they'll run to carbon-14 dating, which is just fairy tale stuff. You talk about Genesis being mythology. Carbon-14 dating is mythology. Just read about it. I'm not going to go into it. It's just get you some good sources and you'll learn some things about that. So the things you've primarily learned in your biology book about how things came to be, I'm not saying all of science lies. I'm not saying all of science is bad. God is not against science. God is certainly the author of science. God is the author of how the world works as far as gravity goes and how as far as condensation and evaporation goes and the weather, the movement of the clouds and sending rain and sending sunshine. God's not anti-scientist. I'm not anti-scientist. I'm anti-evolution. I'm anti-Looney Tunes. I think there's more sense in Yosemite Sam and Bugs Bunny than there is in this. I get a lot more out of it. This stuff is just off the charts. And so whenever you pick up your science book and you pick up your Bible, if that science book doesn't line up with that Bible, then you know that science book can't be trusted. And so what the evolutionist has done is he's just kicked the Bible out. I started out with Kellogg. Remember what he said? Genesis is just a myth, just an allegory, at best an allegory. So anytime you find somebody who's going to kick the Bible out, and then you get really radical evolutionists and they'll kick God out, you just say, okay, see you later, pal. You just wallow around in your own misery. Because things are not getting better and better and better. Things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. That's demonstrable. On the daily news and daily life, you are not getting better. You are not getting younger. You are getting older. And you're going to die at some point. The law of entropy. Demonstrable. Now let's think about this. The nuts and the bolts. The reason I have that up there is because just, again, I'm appealing to your logic. We have a nut and we have a bolt. And if we have a nut and we have a bolt, then we know just by reason that there had to be somebody who made that nut and the bolt. Would you agree that the person who made the nut and the bolt is smarter than the nut and the bolt? Why, of course they are. Pastor, that just makes sense. Of course it makes sense. And that nut and the bolt did not come from nothing. So somebody with sense made the nut and the bolt. They saw a problem and they said, well, we can fix this problem if we just make a nut and a bolt. But let's take it one more step. Not only is the person who made the nut and the bolt smarter than the nut and the bolt, we can take it a step further in saying the person who made the nut and the bolt also came up with a way to make the nut and the bolt. So they have this idea in their head of, I think a nut and a bolt would fix this problem. But now I've got to generate a way in which to make the nut and the bolt. So they're way times smarter than the nut and the bolt because they can not only make the nut and the bolt, they can develop a manufacturing system in which the nut and the bolt is made. Ford had an idea 100 years ago, roughly, about making a car, the combustible engine, the Ford car, which became the model for modern day vehicles. And he had this idea, and he said, well, how can I get us off the horse and get us in a vehicle in which we can travel further? Now, you would have to say that Ford was smarter than his car. He was smarter than his engine. And he figured out things as he went along, and now you drive a car that maybe nobody can figure out because the computer's on it, but there's somebody who can. There's somebody who can figure it out. Maybe you and I can't. Maybe the days of taking care and maintenance in your own car are way past if you're driving a modern car, but still there's people who are smarter than the car. So that's just the fact. So let's take that and translate it now to the earth. And you take any animal, any bird, any plant, take yourself, you're fearfully and wonderfully made, according to Psalm 139. You have to be able to come to the conclusion that there's somebody who made you who's smarter than you. Can I ask you that question honestly? Will you answer it honestly? Do you think there's somebody smarter than you? No matter how smart you are, I don't care what your IQ is. Is there somebody smarter than you? And if you say, well, no, there's nobody smarter than me, then we need to have a long talk. There's somebody smarter than you. And likely on the earth there's someone smarter than you. I may be, by a happen chance, talking to the smartest person in all the world. Congratulations. But there's still somebody smarter than you. And that's God. God's smarter than you. His ways are past finding out. So here we have God. Now what does God do? Well, He'll make a firefly. And that firefly just baffles scientists. There's one guy who dedicated his entire career to studying fireflies. Because man at his best can come up with about 94.5% to be able to create energy, to be able to create that light. He has to use about 94.5%. That firefly only uses 90%, and that's why they're so interested in the firefly. That's why they pay people to catch fireflies and send them off to science. It's because they're still studying that firefly. And maybe someday they'll discover it, but so far it's just baffled them for years. Can you imagine spending 40 years studying a firefly at the end of your career? You don't know any more than when you started. Because you see, if you take a firefly and then you take a candle the same size as the firefly and you light that candle, here's the problem that scientists have. You light that candle and you pick up that candle the same size as that firefly, it'll burn you. Because it only puts off 1/80,000th. 1/80,000th of the same energy as that candle. Because that candle will burn you. But kids can catch fireflies all the time. Doesn't burn them. Boy, they light up the dark night, don't they? How do they do that? Nobody knows. Now, when I say nobody knows, nobody knows. God made that animal. That little insect. God made it. And I like what 1 Corinthians says, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. God just puts some things in creation so that man just scratches his head and can't figure it out. And they run to this and say, well, there's the answer. Well, if that's the answer, why can't you figure out that firefly? Now, you and I, if we were to look at a diving spider, that diving spider, it's oxygen breathing. And so it takes in its oxygen and it has a little bubble and it will dive down into the water, attach itself to vegetation, and there live till it begins to run out of the needed oxygen it has, and then it goes back up, gathers another bubble, and back down. It lives under the water most of the time, but it's oxygen breathing. And then when they have babies, the babies do the same thing. They go get them some oxygen, go down there and help the family. You want to explain that to me? I can explain it to you. God made all things. He created all things. He created the diving spider. He created the firefly. Now, if you and I were to go out and stand in cold water, freezing water, stand in that water, how long do you think you'd last? Now, if you stayed too long, it's going to create hypothermia in your body and you're going to die. You cannot stand it. I know people go ice swimming and dive in, open it up, dive in, break the ice, dive in. They don't last long. They're coming out of that water and they're shivering, they're cold. You just can't live in that water. But there's the wading bird. The wading bird can stand. Now, it's all these next animals I'm going to mention are warm-blooded animals just like you. So the wading bird is a warm-blooded animal, which means that you have to have warmth inside your body to survive. And if you and I stand in that cold water, then it makes our whole body temperature drop. And then we go into hypothermia and we die. But the wading bird, warm-blooded, stand in that freezing water all day. And its body temperature not change. Same thing with the whale and the seal. The whale and the seal, they can swim in that Arctic Ocean. And of course we know the whale, some of you have seen whales, see them blow out that air and suck in that air. And the seals suck in air to live. They're warm-blooded animals. But they can take their naked fins and swim, and their body temperature doesn't drop. How do you explain that? Well, let me tell you how you don't explain it. You don't explain it by evolutionary theory. You only explain it by this. He created all things.